come to Edmonton in February. I enjoyed the crisp walk this morning, very enjoyable. Just to say, Brian, I had no intention about gloating related to anything ice hockey related. I think for an American to come to Canada and gloat about anything is probably inappropriate, given some of the things that are going on south of the border. So, so there'll be no gloating. Just to mention, I had a very pleasant dinner last evening with several folks from various institutions around in Alberta in the health space, and we had a discussion about, you know, what are some of the good things going on in your work life, and it was really interesting to hear the common theme about what great leadership there is for the major at Alberta Health Services, IHE, and so it really seems like quite an opportune time in Alberta to make a lot of good things happen. So you know, quite a good window of opportunity. So it's great to see all the convergence of talent and great leadership and committed people, and it'll be fun for me to kind of watch, see how things evolve over the next few years. So my sort of take on evidence to action has always been a little influenced by some of my experiences working in the Medicare program in the US, where we were trying to be evidence-based policymakers and frequently presented with, you know, less than informative evidence to be evidence-based decision makers. So I've always been really focused on the, you know, the kind of the dilemma and the conundrum of how do we actually make the underlying evidence more suitable for action or decision making. So I'm going to sort of mostly emphasize that, you know, angle on things in my comments today. So yeah, this is just a quick outline. I'm gonna try to accelerate a little bit too, because I think it'd be nice to have a little time for Q&A. But the Center for Medical Technology Policy, just so you know a little bit about my day job, it's an independent nonprofit NGO. It's based in Baltimore, Maryland, and you don't have to really try to read this slide. The basic idea is we like to bring a lot of different experts and stakeholders together and talk about nerdy things about how to design better clinical trials and conduct studies more efficiently. And for those of you in the room who are health economists, I think because our funding model is mostly pre-competitive collaboration, I think what we are empirically demonstrating more than anything is the truth of the free rider problem. So for health economists, that will make sense. But basically, it's the idea that given that everything we do is made public, it's a challenge to get people to pay for it. But we somehow manage. So let me. I'd like to talk about, right, everywhere the issue of affordability and budget impact is a huge issue, right? And so even when you're spending 18% of your gross domestic product on healthcare, which I think is now maybe, you know, trending towards 19% quickly, there's still challenges of affordability. So this is actually, this slide is basically quickly, it's from the state of Massachusetts, and the blue bars here are spending in the year 2001, and the red bars are spending in 2011, and basically you can see that spending on healthcare increased about $5 billion over that 10-year period, and spending on most other public services went down by a net of $4 billion. So public health, mental health, education, infrastructure, you know, housing, et cetera. So it's sort of, you know, there's a lot of caveats to this, but basically it's sort of the myth that there's an infinite amount of money to spend on healthcare and it has no impact on other spending is, this at least suggests that one might want to think twice about that, right? Even when you seem to have, even in countries that seem to have an enormous amount of money to spend on healthcare. And you know, this, I took a quote from David Haslam, who's the chair of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, who, you know, in the UK, I think they're a little bit more mature about the idea that, you know, you can't spend the same dollar twice or the same pound twice. Every pound can be spent once. If we spend unwisely, we risk harming other people whose care will be adversely affected. It's vital that priority setting is an evidence-informed, procedurally fair process. So, right, the focus and the faith of, you know, finding ways to spend money wisely is largely, you know, becomes largely focused on getting the evidence right so you can do the evidence-informed policy. And then, of course, then the challenge there that I really want to then, again, highlight, in more detail is how do we get the evidence better? Because if we don't get the evidence right, we can't get the policy right. Some of you may be familiar. This is from a paper in JAMA from a few years ago. The first author was Pierluigi Tricocci, which I neglected to put on the slide, but it was also Rob Califf was one of the co-authors. This is looking at all of the American College of Cardiology guidelines for atrial fibrillation, heart failure, peripheral arterial disease, and this they rated the percentage of recommendations in the guideline that were based on level 1 evidence, or category, the high quality evidence, right? So atrial fibrillation, 12% of the recommendations based on high quality evidence. It's better for heart failure. It's all the way up to 1/4 of the recommendations, right, based on high quality evidence. So I'm sure this is not a shock to many of you in the audience. Probably, how many folks in the audience actually work to develop clinical guidelines? Okay, anyone have a strong argument that this is an unfair representation of the quality of evidence in clinical guidelines? Someone, raise your hand if you want to dispute it, because everything else I'm going to say is based on the truth of this. Okay, let the record show. No one raised their hand. Anyway, and then this is one of my favorite quotes of all time from a systematic review. Final quote, it's a review of off-label uses of cancer drugs. Because of the paucity of high-quality evidence, the data available, though voluminous, may have little meaning or value for informing clinical practice. This is a review of about 11,000 studies and, a 400-page report, and it's kind of pathetic, But again, I don't know that it's inconsistent with what, our collective impressions are, right? So here's what I call the evidence paradox. Every year, at least 19,000 randomized trials are published, tens of thousands of other clinical studies, and virtually every systematic review that I ever read concludes that the evidence is inadequate or poor quality. You would kind of think with 19,000 shots on goal, every once in a while, right? So it's kind of a mystery. I don't know how much time people, this is what I spend my time in the evening pondering, paradoxes of this nature. Anyway, in the time when I was at Medicare and subsequently, I had a lot of opportunities to talk about this with our National Institutes of Health, but our various research funders about, this problem. And it turns out that when you're talking to people at the NIH who are mostly interested in basic science, you have to be able to explain these things in terms that they are familiar with, in other words, at the cellular level. So I came up with the molecular basis of uncertainty. So this is the way this works, and this literally was originally drawn up on a napkin, so it's important. So if you look at the little orange cloud there, intellectual curiosity sort of drives the clinical research enterprise. You have your published evidence, which slowly diffuses into the cell, which is where the decision makers are. Your policymakers are inside the cell. So KT1 is knowledge translation 1. It's a slow diffusion pathway. Then you've got health technology assessment. It's active transport of evidence to decision makers. You see the decision makers over there in the little rhomboid or whatever that's called. Notice that they are coated with those little yellow balls in the key. Those are low affinity receptors for evidence. So, that's known as the knowledge translation blockade, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not talking about that. That's not actually the point here. As I was saying earlier, most health technology assessments, what they identify is gaps in evidence, things that we don't know that we wish we knew. And the real defect in the system is that you have this defective transport at KT3, cloned, I believe, at Johns Hopkins. The defective transport meaning that the evidence needs of the decision makers are not communicated effectively to the research community, and therefore you have the accumulation of ignorance inside the cell, which is toxic. So this is not too different from the Kymria, video that you saw earlier. So what's the solution to all this is we need better mechanisms to communicate evidence gaps from decision makers to researchers, or those who are supposed to take action on evidence to people who are the generators of evidence, so that we don't continue to have this cycle of progressive ignorance, or whatever you'd want to call it. So that, and if you'd like to see the whole paper, this was actually published in the Christmas issue of the British Medical Journal in 2013, which I'm not sure is an honor, because that's the issue where they publish foolish things. And okay, so this sort of takes us, so this idea of decision maker driven research, and I'll speed through this a little bit, but I can, if you want to know more about it, it's sort of it's kind of it's not dissimilar, or it's sort of informed by the concept of regulatory science. So how many people in the room work in the regulatory field at all? Familiar with regulatory things? Have heard the term regulatory science? Okay. Anyway, so that's the science of developing tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety efficacy of FDA-regulated products, or Health Canada for here, or EMA-regulated products. But this is basically the work that regulators do to communicate what product developers need to do to get regulatory approval. That's kind of regulatory science, more or less. And why is regulatory science important? Because clarity and consistency are required for all regulated industries. They have to know what the requirements are in order to be able to satisfy the requirements. But even more important is there's several legitimate social objectives that regulators are trying to achieve. They want to make sure products are safe and effective, that patients have rapid access, and that the requirements, the regulatory requirements, are also conducive to healthy innovation. So when you're trying to balance all of those things, patient access, innovation, safety, and effectiveness, you have to have a dialogue around what evidence requirements will actually achieve the right balance for all of those objectives, right? And there's a forum and a mechanism for doing that, which is the regulators actually have large programs to develop, to pursue regulatory science. Interestingly, to note that most of that work is actually funded by, at least in the US, by user fees paid by industry. So the work of regulatory science, at least in the US, I don't know about Health Canada, is largely funded by industry user fees that pay for reviews, but they also pay for regulatory science. So I've made up this concept of reimbursement science, or you could call it HTA science, but it would essentially be the analogous notion. Reimbursement science, if it existed, would be the science of developing tools, standards, and approaches to assessing comparative effectiveness and value of products covered by public and private payers, and it would also require a multi-stakeholder forum, dialogue between the HTA community, the folks who control market access, and the regulated industries about what kinds of methods are acceptable for, to inform market access decisions. And I think, Brian, things like scientific advice might sort of fit, at least in the spirit of reimbursement science or HTA science. So what I'm now going to kind of walk you through is what I call an experiment in reimbursement science. In other words, an effort to do sort of the equivalent of what happens in the regulatory world, but do it in the market access space. And this builds a little bit on what Brian was talking about, in that we did this project in the topic area of one of these new advanced therapeutic mechanisms, gene therapy, specifically for hemophilia, which we know is an area where there's probably going to be 8 to 10 products likely on the market within the next 5 years. And in the sort of the market access HTA reimbursement space, everybody's talking about value-based assessments or value frameworks, or how do we determine what is the reasonable value-based pricing for new products. So just to remind folks that if we're really thinking about value and affordability and reasonable spending given clinical benefits, you can't talk about value without talking about outcomes, right? Because essentially, at least according to the Institute of Medicine, value is essentially health outcomes achieved per dollar spent. That's a very simple, stripped-down version of what does value mean. Therefore, unless you are measuring and reporting the right outcomes, you can't get off square one in terms of just dialogue and debate about value. And then Michael Porter, who many of you may have heard about, but he's really pushing this whole idea of value-based healthcare at the health system level. And he talked about health outcomes inherently condition-specific and multidimensional, which is a fancy way of saying, like for diabetes, the meaningful outcomes are things like HbA1c and hypoglycemic episodes and fatigue, et cetera, et cetera. There's multiple different dimensions of meaningful outcomes that contribute to value, but they're condition specific. They're not the same across all conditions. So here's, does anyone recognize what this is? It's from Consumer Reports. Okay. This I find is an important way of explaining the importance of harmonized health outcomes in a non-scientific way. This happens to be a Consumer Reports table for electric drills and screwdrivers. But the key thing here is, so that's what's listed on the left-hand side is what appear to be mostly electric drills and screwdrivers from Japan, but I don't think that was the intent. It just happens to be where a lot of them come from. So, but the key thing here is along the top, right, which is the performance characteristics of the different drills, like the speed, the power, the runtime, the charge time. You can think of those as the key outcomes measures for each of those products, right? And those are not randomly selected. The way Consumer Reports figures out what to compare, what features to report and compare is they have focus groups, they do surveys, and they ask people like, what matters most to you about your electric screwdriver? And then they try to come up with a reasonable number, somewhere like 5 to 7 generally, and then they develop bench tests so those can be measured in a standardized way for every product, and then you have a table like this, which basically, if you want to buy one of these things, you can be fully informed along whatever you care about that happens to be important. If this table was missing, 2/3 of the boxes were not filled in because those performance attributes weren't reported, or they were done using homegrown bench tests, nobody would subscribe to Consumer Reports. It would be a useless publication, right? The only way it's remotely useful is if you have all of the key outcomes reported using the same bench tests for every product, right? This is actually what a Consumer Reports table would look like that people would not purchase, right? Because what use is that? Well, I'm sure none of you are going to be particularly surprised to say that this is what a systematic review looks like for most comparative effectiveness studies of drugs, right? You have a list of drugs on the left side, and along the top you have a miscellaneous assortment of outcomes that are reported differently in different trials using different tools and instruments, and therein lies a problem if you actually want to have some interest in being a value-based purchaser of products and services, right? And I'm just going to do a little quick time check. Yeah, so just to give you one, entertaining example. If you're entertained by things that have to do with steroids for cataract surgery. So this is a review of non-steroidals versus anti-inflammatories versus steroids for inflammation after uncomplicated cataract surgery. They determined what the primary outcome of this review should be by consulting with a whole range of national clinical experts on cataract disease, and they said what would be the preferred primary outcome for trials comparing these two products, and the clinicians' consensus was that we'd like to know the proportion of patients with inflammation at 1 week following surgery. That would be the preferred primary outcome. Can anyone give a guess about how many? Okay, they had 48 trials that were found in the literature that actually did randomized comparison. How many trials reported this primary outcome? Okay, it was 0. So then what were the other trials? So 7 trials actually, instead of the proportion of patients, they reported the mean, which is informative, but less informative than the proportion. And then 11 trials reported the mean at 1 month, not 1 week, meaning there were 37 other trials that didn't report any of those things, okay? So that's kind of the situation. And this, I just want to say, is a fixable problem. This is not actually rocket science to fix this, because for one thing, you already actually had a good idea from a consensus of clinicians about what the primary outcome should be. Somebody should, suggest that to, the next generation of researchers. So anyway, we tried to do this. So this notion of coming up with a consistent set of outcomes so that you have, consumer reports tables for drugs that are more meaningful. It's basically the concept of core outcome sets, which are an agreed standardized set of outcomes should be measured and reported as a minimum in all research in a specific area of healthcare. And there's a large database of these actually on the Comet Initiative website. So a lot of these have been developed. The problem is, while many of these have been developed, they are systematically ignored. For reasons that probably we can talk about in the Q&A. But the point is, lots of very smart people are doing work to try to develop these core outcome sets, but researchers like to use other things. Okay, so we set out to do a project to develop a core outcome set for gene therapy and hemophilia with an idea that if we did it the right way and had the right people around the table, we could actually come up with a core outcome set that actually everybody would use. That was the premise. And one of the key ways that we decided to do that was to actually have the HTA organizations, including CADIF, actually around the table as part of the consensus process to develop these core outcome sets. So the goal of the project was to establish a core set of outcomes to measure the effectiveness and value of gene therapy in hemophilia. The important thing to know is no products had yet even entered their pivotal trials for gene therapy and hemophilia. Several companies had submitted pivotal trial protocols to the FDA for approval of the protocol, but no one had started enrolling patients. So most of these products were still phase 1, phase 2 studies. And we worked with Alfonso Arroyo from McMaster, Mark Skinner, who represented the National Hemophilia Foundation, because a whole key premise of this thing was to put patients literally, well, okay, I was going to say literally at the center, but I don't think Mark sat in the center of the room, so figuratively at the center of the process. And then, our organization helped to kind of manage this. And 7, 8, or 9, basically every company that has an active development program for gene therapy and hemophilia actually participated in and co-sponsored the project. So this was a successful pre-competitive collaboration. And then we got this kind of, Noah's Ark of all the key stakeholders, including, some of the leading clinician experts. We had folks from the FDA. We had all of the companies represented. We had we probably had 7 or 8 representatives of US payers, North American payers and HTA groups, as well as Europeans, including people from NICE, SBU, and UNETA, and then a good number of patient representatives. So, it was a kind of a classic, about 50 people. We did a kind of a 3-stage Delphi process that started with about 59 potential outcomes that we identified in the literature. We went through kind of a formal modified Delphi where at each round we actually fed back the data from the previous round to the entire group and did another round of voting, and we ended up coming up with a core set of 6 outcomes. This is what we did actually in the process of the project was, you can see here, this shows that we asked people to rate the importance of each outcome on a scale of 1 to 9, and then we showed that by the different stakeholder groups, so the patients on the far left. This was an example of an outcome, frequency of bleeds or annual bleed rate, where there was strong consensus across virtually all the stakeholder groups that was a critical outcome. Whereas here's an example, mental health, anxiety, depression, coping, worry. This as a health outcome was clearly viewed to be critically important by the patients, with a lot of variation amongst the other stakeholder groups. Because of the way we sort of structured the consensus rules, this one actually stayed in all the way till the final set, because we wanted to sort of bias the methodology to favor what patients felt was most relevant. And this was sort of the final core set that we came up with: frequency of bleeds, factor activity level, duration of expression, chronic pain. So out of the 58 outcomes that we started with, this was the core set of 6 outcomes that were then recommended by this group for the pivotal studies. And then we had some safety outcomes. And so what is actually interesting that has happened is the 3 companies that had already filed their pivotal trial protocols have now filed amendments to those protocols to include the core set of outcomes. So at least the 3 trials that have been filed so far all are going to use this core set. And I believe the reason for that is the strength of having the National Hemophilia Foundation, the FDA as part of the discussion, as well as multiple payers and HTA groups. And they now, their point of view was, well, we were wondering which patient-relevant outcomes to include. Here was a process to come up with a set, so so it looks like they're going to go with those. And I just want to say, going back to this figure, I think this is a good example of, sort of how to address this, molecular basis of uncertainty, how to come up with, more meaningful consumer reports tables, is to get all the key decision makers together in advance to decide on what's actually meaningful and important in terms of outcomes, and therefore how we should in the future look at assessments of value. So I think I'll just stop there, and hopefully we have some time for questions.